Alireza Firouzja is playing with the white pieces, and Fabiano Caruana is playing with the black pieces. The game starts off with t4, knight f6, bishop f4. This is the London system. This opening got very, very popular right after Magnus Carlsen started playing it, and it's actually a very interesting pet line for many grandmasters who don't necessarily want to go into huge theoretical complications, but would rather keep it more in the out of theory bounds. So bishop f4, and Fabi decides to play the move b6, which is a lesser played move in comparison with moves like d5, or let's say e6 or g6. Perhaps c5 as well, amongst other possibilities, but b6 is one of the lesser played moves. And in this position, Firouzja goes for c4. Usually, whenever white plays the London, they usually opt for a e3, c3 kind of setup, creating like this triangle in the center. But what he goes for is the move c4, a little bit more of an aggressive approach. Maybe he wants to combat the move bishop b7 with the move d5 in the future. So bishop b7, knight c3, d6, knight f3. Both sides are developing their pieces, and black responds with g6. And in this position, white decided to play the move d5, shutting down this bishop on b7, which is a very, very typical idea when we think about it, because right now we're almost getting into a King's Indian pawn structure, and usually in the King's Indian pawn structures, the light square would prefer to be on this diagonal for most part of the game. But it is right now on b7, so the move d5 actually does a great job of shutting down the bishop. Bishop g7, e4, short castles. Bishop d3, both sides are simply developing their pieces, and black played the move e5, asking the question if white would like to go en passant to take the pawn, or would they want to retreat or go bishop g5. In this position, Firouzja decided to play bishop d2. The reason why he doesn't want to take on e6 is because if he does that after f takes e6, the f-file would be opened up in black's favor, as well as the light square bishop on b7 would be opened up, and this would actually be preferable for black. Instead, bishop d2 was played, a5, a very typical move with the idea to play knight a6 to c5, and also stopping the move b2, b4 at the same time. So white played the move a3, potentially threatening to play the move b4, and black responded with knight a6, stopping the idea of b4. So both sides are actually doing fairly logical things. White plays bishop to c2, so that if black, he was here to play knight c5, then white can easily respond with the move b4, hitting the knight on c5. So therefore, c5 was played rather than knight to c5. Essentially, the idea is that black would love to stop any counterplay happening on the queen side by possibly closing the position, and perhaps think about some attack on the king side in the future with the preparation of the move f5. Although the position is very close, it doesn't seem like it's possible yet. In this position, black would rather close the queen side so that there is no attack happening with b2, b4 for white. So white plays bishop g5. For similar reasons as before, white doesn't really want to go en passant, because after bishop takes, then this bishop would have an easy target on the e4 pawn, and after the knight joins to c5, then they will be attacking the c5 pawn, and this would give black a decent position after the trade. So instead, bishop g5 was played, h6, bishop e3. So white actually provoked this move h6, which could potentially be a weakness in the future after moves like queen d2 that would attack this pawn, but also moves like h3, g4, g5 might be in white's agenda, and that would also target this pawn h6. So black responds with knight c7, h3 is played, it's also preventing knight g4 at the same time and preparing the g4, g5 launch for the future. Bishop c8, now that the bishop actually has nothing to do on this diagonal, black is trying to improve the fate of this bishop by putting it on c8. And white plays queen d2, attacking the pawn on h6. King goes to h7. White plays the move g4. And in this position, black plays the move rook b8. And the reason why black plays this move is they would love to create some counterplay with b6, b5 to open up the queen side, because white is very dominant on the king side at the moment. So black at least needs to create some counterplay in order to have some chances. White plays the move g5 here, which is opening up the king side, and it is a very good move. And after h takes g5, bishop takes g5 is played, allowing the move b5. Perhaps what white could have done instead of bishop takes g5 would have been to take it with the knight instead, and after the king drops, they could have considered the move a3, a4 that would have stopped all sorts of counterplays with the b5 idea. In this position, perhaps white did not like the fact that they are actually leaving this b4 square empty, so maybe something like knight a6 followed by knight b4 could be possible, or perhaps maybe black could play something like knight h5 followed by knight f4, so they wanted to maybe pin the knight on f6 by playing bishop takes g5, but this allowed black to play the move b7, b6, b5, which creates decent counterplay on the queen side. White is going h4. They are doing their best to open up the king side, and around this moment, Firouzja has roughly 15 minutes as opposed to Fabi's 35 minutes. So black has a huge time advantage, and in these types of positions, if you don't necessarily create the attack that you want with white, things can actually go wrong on the queen side or on the other sides of the board. So bishop g4, it's a good move, developing the bishop, attacking the knight, also preventing the move h5. Bishop d1, protecting the knight, and then black played queen d7, h5. So white is trying to open up the position. Knight takes h5, knight h4, bishop takes d1, queen takes d1. So now, in this position, white is actually threatening this idea of knight to f5 with the idea to take on h5 and create an attack. So if black were to play, let's say b takes c4, for example, white would play the move knight f5, and let's say black ignores and takes on b2, then white would play, let's say, rook takes, pawn takes, queen takes, king g8, and then knight h6 or knight e7 check. That would win the game, win the queen, and then the game later. So that's the idea for white. Rook h8 is played, and after knight f5, g takes f5, queen takes h5, and king to g8. So the difference is, now that the rook is on h8, white cannot play the move queen h7 checkmate. But white has to retreat. Rook takes h1, queen takes h1, f6, and bishop drops back. Pawn goes to b4, attacking the knight. Black is attacking the center with the f5 pawn while attacking the knight on c3. ab4, ab4, knight goes back to e2. And in this position, black played the move f4, which is a very powerful move. It is totally restricting this bishop from doing anything. Similarly, the dog-squared bishop of the black piece is also not doing much, but in this position, black is doing better because they are up a pawn. Knight went to g1, black goes queen g4, king f1, rook a8, black is fine with the trade, rooks are off the board, and queen f3. And essentially this was the critical blunder of the game. If white played the move f3, black would have to drop back with the queen somewhere, and it almost looks like there is no entry square for anyone to make progress, and therefore probably the expected result of this game would have been a draw. But after queen f3, which was played under severe time pressure, here came the move f5. And the key idea of f5 is that black is doing their best to open up their bishop for some activity. And after queens were traded, king f3 was played, knight b6 hitting this pawn, b3 defending the pawn, and now that knight is rerouting itself, maybe it will find itself on f6 with the idea to put pressure on the e4 pawn. Knight went to d2, king is coming up, and black is up a pawn, so they are going for this pawn, it's defended, and then some shuffling, and bishop g5. This knight is unfortunately tied down to the defense of this pawn, and eventually the move f3 came in, where white has to move their knight, and then there is no way to stop. Knight takes b3, king f7 is a very nice touch. Knight takes b3 would still be winning, but it would allow the move bishop b7, which would give white some counterplay chances, and therefore black played the move king f7 since the bishop is actually doing a great job controlling the square. Black took the pawn, and few moves later, Fabiano Caruana won the first game with the black pieces. It was a up and down game, I have to say. White was better out of the opening, maybe had very good chances to win the game if they played knight takes e5 and a4, but Caruana defended really well, and at the end of the day was able to stop all white's attacking ideas and went on to win the game. So that was the first conclusive game that we're going to see for today. Alright, so now let's move on to the battle between Nodirbek Abdusattorov and Praggnanandhaa. So this is a battle of two very young, very talented players. And Nodirbek, playing with the white pieces, plays e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5 by Ruy Lopez, a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castles, bishop c5, and Arkhangelsk variation, c3, b5, bishop b3, d6, a4. So in this position, the main responses for black are rook b8, bishop b7, or bishop g4. But in this position, interestingly, Praggnanandhaa goes for the move b4, which is a lesser played move. White responds with d4, bishop goes to a7, and d takes e5. Here, perhaps white could have played bishop g5, but I'm pretty sure Pragg had something in mind against this move, and we will probably be seeing if it will be played later in the future against them. But white instead took on e5. He is probably going for this much more simpler approach, and it is a good idea to think about trading queens sometimes and leaving this king in the center, perhaps to create some attack on the f7 pawn and maybe get the open file. But it's not so easy, because if we were to take on f7, in this position black can actually play the move rook f8, which is a very typical idea in the Ruy Lopez and the Italian, and they would actually start exerting pressure on this diagonal. If the white bishop were to retreat to, let's say, somewhere like c4, in this position black can even play knight takes e4, attacking f2. And unfortunately for white, this tactic doesn't work. It's a common one, but it doesn't really work in this case, because if knight takes f2, and if you were to take the rook, there would be a very nice checkmating combination. Knight h3 check, double check, so you're actually forced to step out, and then rook takes f1 would end the game. Of course, this is a sample line, but just wanted to show it. So white in this position played the move queen c2 instead, not wanting to trade the queens and defending the pawn on e4, perhaps wanting to go c takes b4. Short castles happen, c takes b4, rook b8, attacking the pawn, and white defended the pawn by playing b5, offering a trade of these pawns, and in this position, the rook is attacking the bishop. Therefore, black is unable to take on b5. So they played the move bishop d4 instead. White played knight c3, developing the knight and defending the pawn. bishop d7, hitting the pawn. Bishop goes to c4. And here, Black played the critical move bishop takes c3, getting rid of the pair of bishops, but they are fine with that, because they will be picking up the pawn that they have given earlier in the game on b4. Rook d1, queen c8, bishop b3, and white is trying to put some pressure here. Black is developing the pieces. Bishop f1. Bishop takes here. Now, queen e2, rook e8, bishop g5. So white has given up a pawn, but they are putting a lot of pressure on the e5 pawn. They're putting a lot of pressure on the knight. So, this was a logical sequence of events where white has the bishop pair, while black has an extra pawn. Rook d8, offering a trade of rooks. White is not interested in that, so black is surely doing slightly better, because now that they traded a pair of bishops, essentially now as white is left with a single bishop, therefore black could claim some slight advantage due to their extra pawn on e5, but then they traded into a rook endgame with double rooks on the board, and soon enough this turned into a 3 versus 3 on the king side and a b-pawn for black, which is a draw in normal situation. So Abdusattorov didn't really have a tough time defending this position with the white pieces, and although Praggnanandhaa tried to win, there was really not much of a chance in this rook endgame. So the game simply ended in a draw after a repetition on move 64. So a very exciting game, and but it was a draw at the end with very good defending skills by Nodirbek in this game. So now we can move on to the next game. This game is between NVL Maxime Vachier-Lagrave versus Jan Nepomniachtchi. And NVL starts off the game with e4, and Nepo plays his favorite Petrov defense. Nepo has been playing this for a very, very long time at this point, and he is very knowledgeable about the ins and outs of the opening. NVL wanted to test him in a variation which I believe Nepo had no games in, at least in practice. In this position, Hikaru Nakamura played g3 against Nepo and the candidates, which also ended in a very exciting draw, with a lot of interesting moments of that game. But in this game, NVL chose the move knight bd2, which is also a very interesting, challenging try against the system. Rook e8 was played, knight h4, bishop went back to e6, queen goes to c2, attacking this knight, knight goes to a6, trying to work on b4, a3, bishop g4. So these are all actually theoretical moves that has happened in the past, and Nepo and NVL, they were both just recalling their preparation, and they just kept on recalling. And in this position, white played the move bishop takes h7, which I believe is the new move of the game. My database was not showing any games with bishop takes h7. It was only showing games that were played with knights back to f3. The white plays bishop h7, king h8, and g3 was played on the board. And here black responded with g6. Now the bishop is trapped, so white goes queen e4, queen e6, bishop takes g6, sacrificing the bishop essentially for a lot of pawns and opening up the king. King f7 was played, knight e5 check, bishop takes e5, bishop takes e5. So up until this moment, NVL had only spent roughly around 10 minutes, and Nepo had only spent roughly 15 minutes, which is already showing that both sides are completely in theoretical knowledge, and they are just recalling their variations, and just double-checking that they remember things correctly. So rook joins to d1, trying to go rook to d6, which would attack the queen, rook e8, hitting the bishop on e5. Bishop drops back to c3, knight goes to e4, attacking the bishop, g4, utilizing the pin on the bishop, attacking the bishop, knight takes c3, pawn takes c3, rook goes to g8, pinning the pawn to the king, like this. h3, queen f6, queen c7, check, queen e7, queen back to f4, and that was a repetition. So, a very eventful draw in this game. And I believe both sides were basically in theoretical knowledge till the end of the game. Very, very high knowledge by both sides. And yeah, so that was a very exciting draw from MVL and Nepo. So we can now move on to the next game. And the next game is Gukesh versus Bogdan-Daniel. So Gukesh, being the World Championship challenger, is getting some gains in and making sure that he is practicing and getting all sorts of preparation for the World Championship. And Bogdan-Daniel, being a local, is representing Romania in the tournament. So he has the opportunity to play against the best in the world, and battle it out with these top players. So Gukesh goes d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop e4. We have the Nimzo Indian, and Gukesh decides to go with e3, which is a very, very trendy line at this moment, and he goes bishop to d2. Black goes c5, Black responds with d5, Black responds with d6, so both sides are playing this position relatively quickly, and we had the first relatively long think of the game already in this position. Black played the move e5 after a approximately 10-minute think, which is showing that maybe White is playing a relatively new system, or Black is trying to choose between their own favorites variations. So ed5, cd5, knight bd7, knight ge2, knight e5, bishop drops back, rook b8, trying to play it. Moves like b5, b5 is played, a3, netting the bishop, bishop goes to a5, White goes h3 in this position, perhaps preventing any knights jumping to g4 and thinking about ideas like f2, f4, that would hit the knight, and it would not allow knight going to g4. So rook e8 was played, knight g3 in response, eyeing the idea of playing knight f5 in the future, knight c4 hitting the pawn as well as the bishop, therefore bishop c1 was played, and in this position we get an extremely sharp position. Black is going for the pawn on c3, but White is okay with sacrificing that temporarily in order to get this beautiful diagonal for their dark squared bishop. White goes rook to b3, hitting the queen. Queen goes back to e5. White plays the move e4. So White is essentially trying to start a kingside attack by playing f4 eventually. And if they could utilize this diagonal, that would also be very good. But the knight on c4 is not allowing that at the moment. So Black plays the move h5, which is a very powerful move, trying to go h4. White plays bishop d3, with the idea to take the knight due to the pin on that rook. Bishop d7 was played in response. h4 would have also been an interesting move. That would force the knight to drop back, and then bishop d7 could be interesting, with the idea that if White goes f4 here, Black can respond with the move queen e7 or queen h5, both possible, putting pressure on the e4 pawn, and this would be good for Black. So f4 would indeed not be a good move. Perhaps White can play bishop f4, queen e7, and just keep playing on in this position, maybe with bishop g5, hitting the pawn, and the game would go on in this fashion. But instead in the game, bishop d7 was played, to which white played the move f4, attacking the queen, queen d4 check, king h1, and here came a interesting blow by black. Knight takes e4, taking the free, not the free pawn, taking the pawn on e4, which actually gives up an exchange. The bishop takes e4 was played, and here black played the move rook takes e4, which is a slight inaccuracy. In this position it would have been better for black to take on d1, rook takes on d1, and play the move that nobody would expect, the move b4, with the idea to play bishop to a4, that would skewer the rook on d1 and b3. And actually this was the opportunity for black to capitalize, and that would have given them a big advantage after all these sequence moves, a relatively forced sequence, take, and this position is actually clearly favorable for black, because they have the outside passed pawn, and they are doing better in terms of material as well, since they have two pawns and the rook versus a knight and the bishop, which would make them ahead in material. But instead, black played the move rook takes e4, which is an inaccuracy. In the reality, the correct variation for white would be knight takes e4, rook takes e4, and queen takes h5, which would be the correct line, but it is not very easy to spot it in practical sense, and this position would be possibly around equal or maybe slightly preferable for black. And if they were to go rook e4, bishop e4, queen e4, this would transpose into the game. So bishop takes e4, inaccuracy by white, rook takes e4, inaccuracy by black pieces. So knight takes e4, queen takes e4, rook e1, queen goes back to g6, to h7. Queen g6 was also possible here, just to keep it a little bit more active on the king side. Queen h7 went, rook e7 hitting the bishop, rook d8, and now white is trying to open up the queen side with the move a4, king f8, attacking the rook, queen e2, knight went to b6, attacking the pawn on d5, and then a takes b5 happened, knight takes d5 happened, rook dropped back, and in this position, black actually missed a very elegant tactic. White was down to 9 minutes on the clock. They had a huge time advantage before, but now white was down to 9 minutes, and black had only 1 minute. But black missed a beautiful tactic here. Bishop takes b5. If you were to take it with the queen, then your rook would be hanging. If you were to take it with the rook, then there would be the move knight c3 that would fork all the three pieces and would win the game for black. So therefore, after bishop b5, here, white would be forced to retreat the queen, but that would give black a big advantage after bishop c6. So, rook e4. Queen f5 was played, which was not a very good move, allowing rook to a4, going to a7 very soon, and then knight d4 was the crucial blunder, with couple seconds left on the clock, just hanging the d6 pawn. I'm sure black did see the d6 pawn hanging, but the a7 pawn is the real problem at the moment. So in this position, eventually, white was able to take all the pawns and consolidate, and went on to winning the game. After a long battle, in the end, with both sides being under a minute, here, Bogdan-Daniel resigned, because this knight is absolutely tied to the back rank, and the mating ideas with the rook and the bishop are very, very crucial, putting pressure on the black king. So this was the second decisive game, and there were two decisive games in this round. And now we can move on to the final game of the round, which was played between Anish, Giri and Wesley. So Let's start with the game Anish versus Wesley. So, white played the move d4, knight f6, and Anish and Wesley, they have played each other many times at very high-level events, at various settings. So white goes for the Catalan, and we have one of the main lines of the Catalan. White goes a4, bishop d7, queen c4, bishop goes to c6, bishop goes to f4, a5, knight c3, knight d7. So this is all, pretty standard. At this point, bishop drops back to d2 or knight d4. At least structurally is very standard. Knight g5, offering a trade of these bishops. h6, knight back to f3, b6. Both sides are playing very solidly without creating any weaknesses. White in this position could have possibly opted for the move e4, to which maybe black would just respond with something like rook e8, or maybe e5 is the correct approach. This position e5 could be a possibility as well. Rook e8 or maybe c6 sometimes is an option in these types of positions, with the idea to put the queen on c7. So curious to see what would have happened if e4 was played, but it was played a couple moves later, to which black actually did not really react with any of the pawn pushes. They kept the pawns as they were, and after some simple moves, couple trades happened, and eventually players just repeated in a very peaceful fashion.
Thank you for watching the video. Don't forget to give us a like and subscribe.